Hello, all. Welcome to Dragon in Winterfell, a podcast centered on works of fantasy and historical fiction. Today I'm heading back to Westeros with a theory on the Princess in the North, Arya Stark. Arya hears dead people. Yes, that's right, she hears the dead. While this character is often associated with death due to the list of criminals she wants to see executed for their crimes, what's often overlooked is that there are multiple times where she's dealing with ghosts, including hearing them. From Syrio guiding Arya after his murder, to Ned galvanizing her to reclaim her identity, this recurring aspect of her story seems hugely significant. The first time Arya hears the dead is in A Game of Thrones after Syrio sacrifices his life so Arya can escape. "Calm as still water," a voice whispered in her ear. Arya was so startled she almost dropped her bundle. She looked around wildly, but there was no one in the stable but her, and the horses, and the dead men. Quiet as a shadow, she heard. Was it her own voice, or Sirio's? She could not tell, yet somehow it calmed her fears. This moment is very reminiscent of Star Wars: A New Hope, when, like with Arya and Syrio, Luke Skywalker's mentor is murdered while protecting him. Immediately afterward, Luke starts hearing Obi-Wan's voice in his head, giving him instructions. In that film, we know it's Obi-Wan because it's Alec Guinness's voice, and he's giving advice that goes counter to Luke's instincts. With Arya, we know this instance isn't just her remembering Sirio's sayings, but Syrio himself speaking because of her response to hearing him. She has an intense physical reaction and looks around herself for the source of the voice. The other times it happens, she's more comfortable hearing the voice and following the instructions or heeding his wisdom. Here are a few examples. When the Lannisters attempt to capture Arya by dressing their own men in Stark uniforms and stationing them outside of the ship that Ned hired to send her home, before she approaches these men, she hears a warning. Two of the guardsmen were dicing together while the third walked rounds, his hand on the pommel of his sword. Ashamed to let them see her cry like a baby, she stopped to rub her eyes. Her eyes, her eyes, her eyes. Why did... "Look with your eyes," she heard Syrio whisper. Arya looked. She knew all of her father's men. The three in the gray cloaks were strangers. During A Clash of Kings, when the gold cloaks catch up with Arya and the Night's Watch recruits, her dancing master gives her another reminder. "Look with your eyes," Sirio's voice seemed to whisper. Her eyes saw white lather under their saddles. The horses had been ridden long and hard. When Arya enters the House of Black and White for the first time in A Feast for Crows, Syrio refuses to allow her to hide from the truth of what she's seeing. When Arya peered around, she saw other alcoves too. On some there were old people sleeping. "No," a half-remembered voice seemed to whisper in her head. "They are dead or dying. Look with your eyes." So while there are several occasions when Arya repeats his words to herself for guidance and strength, those are clearly differentiated from the moments when he is speaking to her. In the audiobook, the narrator even shifts to Sirio's voice in those moments, making it clear that these are not Arya's thoughts, but words whispered to her by her dead mentor. In fact, what's interesting about the audiobook is that Sirio's voice is more consistent than the voices the narrator uses for most of the characters. Another instance of Arya hearing the dead is in A Clash of Kings, when a severely wounded woman found by Yoren dies. She had been found along with Weasel in the raided holdfast. After what she had experienced, all she could say was, "Please," over and over again until she died. But after her death, Arya continued to hear her. The one-armed woman died at evenfall. Gendry and Cutjack dug her a grave on a hillside beneath a weeping willow. When the wind blew, Arya thought she could hear the long, trailing branches whispering, "Please, please, please." The little hairs on the back of her neck rose, and she almost ran from the gravesite. On its own, this moment can be interpreted as a symptom of Arya's trauma. She's being exposed to a great deal of horrors and atrocities as she and her party travel through a war zone. The death of this woman and the unanswered pleas could have resulted in her imagining that she could still hear her even after her death. But since we have multiple instances of Arya hearing the dead, this moment is part of a pattern. Continuing this pattern is one of the most powerful scenes in Arya's story. During a clash of kings, she speaks to her murdered father, Arya Stark, through the Heart Tree in Harrenhal. Then, so faintly, it seemed as if she heard her father's voice. "When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives," he said. "But there is no pack," she whispered to the weirwood. "Bran and Rickon were dead. The Lannisters had Sansa. Jon had gone to the Wall. I'm not even me now. I'm Nan. You are Arya of Winterfell, daughter of the North. You told me you could be strong. You have the wolf blood in you." Now, there is room for debate on what exactly is going on in this scene. Is this Ned reaching out to Arya from beyond the grave? Possibly. Is this Bran taking on his father's voice in order to give Arya guidance that she needs to save herself? Again, possibly. All we know is that Arya heard the voice of her father referencing a private conversation the two of them had together. So it is very possible that Ned is the third voice of the dead that Arya has heard, and he happens to be the one she had a back and forth conversation with. Since no other characters hear the voices of the dead unless they're dreaming or delirious, it's likely that this is an important skill that only Arya has. What I'm curious about is what Arya's ability to hear the dead will mean going forward in the story. Will this make conversing with Lady Stoneheart easier? More important to the story's climax, will she be able to understand whites? Jon Snow was trying to find out if it was possible to communicate with them. Arya might be the answer. Here's the scene where George R.R. Martin set up the possibility of communicating with the foot soldiers of the enemy during a dance with dragons. "Might I ask about the corpses in the ice cells? They make the men uneasy, and to keep them under guard? Surely that is a waste of two good men, unless you fear that they will rise? I pray they do." Septon Celador paled. "Seven save us." Wine dribbled down his chin in a red line. "Lord Commander, whites are monstrous, unnatural creatures, abominations before the eyes of the gods. You cannot mean to try to talk with them." "Can they talk?" asked Jon Snow. "I think not, but I cannot claim to know. Monsters they may be, but they were men before they died. How much remains? The one I slew was intent on killing Lord Commander Mormont. Plainly it remembered who he was and where to find him." Maester Aemon would have grasped his purpose, Jon did not doubt. Sam Tarly would have been terrified, but he would have understood as well. "My Lord Father used to tell me that a man must know his enemies. We understand little of the whites and less about the others. We need to learn." Here it's clearly set up that there is a possibility that whites may be able to communicate and that there's still something of the person they once were left inside of them. With Arya being able to hear the dead and even speak back to them, her skill could be essential in fighting them and learning the secrets of the others. It's also possible that this scene was establishing a future twist for Jon himself. At the end of A Dance with Dragons, Jon was stabbed multiple times, and his last thoughts before his chapter ended were of his last conversation with Arya. Stick 'em with the pointy end. While the adaptation for the novels gives Benioff and Wise's take on how this situation is resolved for Jon Snow, their story choices have no connection with what George R.R. Martin is planning. I mean, come on. Jon just wakes up completely fine with no repercussions whatsoever. We know how Martin feels about resurrected characters because he has spoken about this before. Here's an excerpt from the Time magazine interview he did. Martin: "And here I've got to get back to Tolkien again. And I'm going to seem like I'm criticizing him, which I guess I am. It's always bothered me that Gandalf came back from the dead. The Red Wedding for me in Lord of the Rings is the Mines of Moria, and when Gandalf falls, it's a devastating moment. I didn't see it coming at 13 years old. It just took me by surprise. Gandalf can't die. He's the guy that knows all of the things that are happening. He's one of the main heroes here. Oh god, what are they going to do without Gandalf? Now it's just the hobbits? And Boromir and Aragorn? Well, maybe Aragorn will do, but it's just a huge moment, a huge emotional investment. And then, in the next book, he shows up again, and it was 6 months between the American publications of those books, which seemed like a million years to me. So all that time, I thought Gandalf was dead, and now he's back, and now he's Gandalf the White, and he's more or less the same as always, except he's more powerful. It's always felt a bit like a cheat to me. And as I got older and considered it more, it also seemed to me that death doesn't make you more powerful. That's in some ways me talking to Tolkien in the dialogue saying, yeah, if someone comes back from the dead, especially if they suffer a violent traumatic death, they're not going to come back as nice as ever. That's what I was trying to do, and am still trying to do with the Lady Stoneheart character. Interviewer. And Jon Snow, too, is drained by the experience of coming back from the dead on the show. Martin. Right. And poor Beric Dondarrion, who was set up as a foreshadowing for all of this. Every time he's a little less Beric, his memories are fading. He's got all these scars. He's becoming more and more physically hideous because he's not a living human being anymore. His heart isn't beating. His blood isn't flowing in his veins. He's a white, but a white animated by fire instead of by ice. And now we're getting back to the whole fire and ice thing. Given Martin's views on resurrecting characters, it's safe to say that if Jon is dead in the books, he will not be in the same condition that he was in during the later seasons of the adaptation. Just as Beric got worse after every resurrection, and Catelyn was far, far worse than Beric was, Jon will likely continue that trend in being in an even worse state than Catelyn is. Or at least a different one. Given the fact that Jon and Arya have the closest relationship to any characters in the novels, and his last thoughts and choices are centered on her, it's possible that Arya may be able to communicate with Jon in whatever form he takes. One possibility is that Jon's life force will transition into Ghost. This is quite heavily foreshadowed just by the name of the direwolf himself. Prologue of A Dance with Dragons details what happens to a skin changer after they die and how they gain a second life in one of the animals they control. Ghost is specifically noted as being an ideal animal for this as a direwolf rather than a normal wolf. Martin sets this up at the beginning of the same novel that Jon ends the book presumably dead in. In this case, Arya might be able to communicate with Jon while he is experiencing his second life in Ghost. Another potential outcome is that Jon will be the third Fire White we see in the series, following in the footsteps of Beric and Catelyn. As Lady Stoneheart, Catelyn can barely speak. Depending on how everything pans out, Jon could be in even worse shape. And yet another possibility is a combination of the previous two. What if Jon's consciousness goes into Ghost, but his body is resurrected as a Fire White? That would be an interesting premise to explore, with Jon seeing his body resurrected, completely outside of his own control. And of course, in that situation, Arya would be the one to see what was going on and be able to communicate with both versions of him. I would also argue that Arya facing off with a dead Jon is already foreshadowed in the very first novel when Arya remembers a moment from their childhood. Robb took them all the way down to the end, past Grandfather and Brandon and Lyanna, to show them their own tombs. Sansa kept looking at the stubby little candle, anxious that it might go out. Old Nan had told her there were spiders down here, and rats as big as dogs. Robb smiled when she said that. There are worse things than spiders and rats, he whispered. This is where the dead walk. That was when they heard the sound, low and deep and shivery. Baby Bran had clutched at Arya's hand. When the spirit stepped out of the open tomb, pale and white and moaning for blood, Sansa ran shrieking for the stairs, and Bran wrapped himself around Robb's leg, sobbing. Arya stood her ground and gave the spirit a punch. It was only Jon, covered in flour. You stupid, she told him. You scared the baby. But Jon and Robb just laughed, and pretty soon Bran and Arya were laughing too. This is a sweet moment in the novel that helps Arya gain courage to continue on, but it could also be setting up a future reunion between the siblings where they reunite in a darker way. Arya possessing the ability to hear the dead may be central in the coming novels, not only in communicating with the Whites, but also in interacting with her brother and possibly her mother in their zombie conditions. Anyway, what do you think? Is Arya actually hearing the dead? Will this be important going forward? Let me know what you think down in the comments below.